The gavel had not yet struck the podium when every man in the room went quiet, because Isaiah Sullivan had just cleared his throat. It was the autumn of 1878, and the territorial town of Cutter's Bend, Texas, sat baking under a sun that had no patience for the weak. The Lone Star Auction House, if you could call a wide-planked building with a warped roof and 3 cracked windows an auction house, had been the site of more land disputes, broken handshakes, and shattered fortunes than any courthouse within 100 miles. Men came here to win or to lose everything they had, and for the better part of 6 years, the difference between those two outcomes had rested almost entirely on whether Isaiah Sullivan showed up. He was 31 years old, with dark brown hair that curled just slightly at the ends when the humidity crept in off the river, and eyes the deep gray of a sky before a storm breaks loose. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in worn leather boots that had walked every inch of this county, and when he spoke at auction, the sound of his voice carried a kind of authority that made other men reconsider their bids before they even opened their mouths. He did not shout. He never had to. There was something in the steadiness of it, the certainty, that made every syllable feel like a declaration of something already decided. His reputation had grown slowly, then all at once, the way most things do in the West. He had started bidding on behalf of the Donovan Cattle Company out of San Antonio when he was 25, acting as their land agent and proxy bidder across a stretch of territory that ran from the Brazos River east to the hill country. In those first years he had been methodical, careful, patient in the way of a man who understood that land was permanent and money was not. He learned which parcels had good water access and which were dry in summer. He learned which sellers were desperate and which ones were bluffing. He learned that silence, at exactly the right moment, was more powerful than any number. By 1878, the Donovan Company had acquired over 40,000 acres through Isaiah's work, and the man himself had earned a modest percentage of each successful acquisition. He was not rich by any standard that would impress a San Francisco banker, but he had more than enough, and he had a small house on the eastern edge of Cutter's Bend with a porch that caught the evening breeze, and a horse named Charter who was the color of burnt clay. That was sufficient for him. He had told himself that many times. The auction that Tuesday morning was for a 200-acre parcel along the South Fork of the Brazos, and it had drawn a crowd larger than usual. Word had gone around that the Donovan Company wanted this particular piece badly enough to authorize Isaiah to go well over market price. The other bidders knew this, or suspected it, and several of them had already done the quiet mathematics of figuring out whether it was worth contesting a man who bid not just with money, but with an institutional certainty that felt almost geological. Isaiah stood near the back of the room in his usual spot, hat held in both hands, watching the auctioneer sort his papers. He had already inspected the land the previous week. The South Fork water access was clean, the soil was rich enough for grazing, and the property line connected neatly to the southeastern edge of the Donovan holdings. It was a logical purchase. He intended to acquire it in as few bids as possible and then have himself a quiet lunch. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Clement Briggs who wore the same brown vest to every auction regardless of the season, rapped the podium once with his knuckles. The room settled. Clement began his recitation of the property details, and Isaiah let his gaze drift briefly toward the front door, which had been propped open to let in whatever air might be persuaded to move. That was when Theresa Slater walked in. She came through the door the way someone enters a room they are not certain they are permitted to enter, which is to say, with a quiet kind of deliberate confidence that is somehow more striking than swagger. She was 27 years old, though Isaiah would not learn this until later. She wore a dress that had once been a deep blue and had faded to a dusty gray blue at the shoulders from too many days under the same sun that baked everyone else in Cutter's Bend. She had dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical arrangement that was not quite managing to contain itself, and her eyes were a shade of brown so warm it was nearly amber, the color of good whiskey held up to lamplight. She was carrying a leather satchel tucked under one arm and a folded piece of paper in her other hand, and she was looking at the auctioneer's podium with an expression of quiet determination that Isaiah had seen on exactly no woman who had ever entered Clement Briggs's auction house in all the years he had been coming here. Isaiah watched her take a position along the left wall. She unfolded the paper, read something on it, refolded it precisely, and tucked it into the satchel. Then she looked up at the auctioneer and waited. Clement Briggs began the bidding on the South Fork parcel at $600. A man named Hargrove, who represented a small ranch operation out of Waco, opened at $650. Isaiah opened his mouth to say $700, which was his standard second-step number on a $600 open, and found that the words had simply not arrived. He stood there for half a second with his mouth slightly open, which was a thing that had never happened to him in the entire history of his bidding career. The number was in his head. He knew it was in his head. $700. $700. But between his brain and his voice there was some new and inexplicable obstruction, and that obstruction had dark auburn hair and amber eyes and was standing along the left wall with a satchel under her arm. Hargrove's $650 hung in the air. Someone else said $680. Isaiah did not look to see who. $700, he told himself firmly in the privacy of his own skull, and then looked at the woman again, and managed to produce the sound of a man preparing to speak but not yet speaking, which was something between a breath and a consonant, and was, in the context of land auctions, completely useless. He recovered. He had to recover. He had people depending on him and a letter of authorization in his breast pocket, and a professional obligation that did not have room for whatever was currently happening. $750, he said, and his voice came out exactly as it always did, steady and assured, and the room shifted slightly the way it always did when he spoke, and Hargrove looked down at his hands. But Isaiah Sullivan, the most feared voice at every land auction between San Antonio and Abilene, had just spent a full 4 seconds standing silent in a room where silence cost money, because a woman had walked in and he had forgotten every word he knew. He won the South Fork parcel for $820, which was within his authorized range, and he signed the transfer paperwork with Clement Briggs and shook the necessary hands, and through all of it, he was acutely aware of exactly where Theresa Slater was standing in the room. She had bid. That was the other thing. Somewhere in the middle of the auction, when 2 other men had been trading offers on the South Fork with what they imagined was momentum, she had raised her hand and said, clearly and without hesitation, $7 per acre on the northeast quarter only, if it can be divided. Clement Briggs had blinked at her, the way a man blinks when confronted with something that exists outside of his previous understanding of the world. Several of the men in the room had exchanged the kind of glances that said things without words that Isaiah found uncharitable and inaccurate. The South Fork parcel was not divisible under the terms of that particular auction, and Clement had told her so gently, and she had nodded once and said, "I understand, thank you," and had not seemed remotely embarrassed. Isaiah found himself standing near the door as the room began to empty, and he was not entirely sure how he had gotten there or what precise motivation had placed him in that location, rather than walking directly out as he usually did. He watched Theresa Slater speak briefly with Clement Briggs, who was shaking his head in a way that suggested he was explaining something she did not want to hear. She listened, nodded again, wrote something in a small notebook, and then turned toward the exit. She nearly walked straight into Isaiah. "Pardon me," she said, stepping to the side with an ease that suggested she was used to navigating around large obstacles. "No fault of yours," he said, which was both true and, he recognized in real time, a fairly unremarkable thing to say. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, and he had the sensation, brief and disorienting, of not being entirely sure what year it was. "Were you the one bidding for the Donovan Company?" she asked. He nodded. "Isaiah Sullivan. I act as their land agent." "Theresa Slater," she said, and shook his hand with the kind of grip that meant she had been in working Texas for some time. "I was trying to inquire about the northeast quarter specifically. Do you know if there are any smaller parcels along that stretch of the South Fork that might come to auction separately? Or that might be privately negotiated?" He did know. As a matter of fact, there was a 60-acre section immediately north of the parcel he had just acquired, belonging to a man named Odell Price, who had been making quiet noises about selling for the better part of a year, but had not yet committed to any formal action. Isaiah was aware of this because it was his business to be aware of such things. He had filed the information in the back of his mind under things to address once the South Fork purchase was finalized, and he had intended to approach Price on the Donovan Company's behalf sometime in the following 2 weeks. "There may be something," he said. "What's your purpose for the land, if you don't mind my asking?" She studied him for a moment as if deciding whether he deserved the information. Apparently he met whatever criteria she was applying, because she said, "My brother and I are looking to establish a small cattle and goat operation. We've been working outside Waco for 3 years on borrowed land. We need our own water access, and that stretch of the South Fork has the right conditions. We have enough capital for 60 acres if the price is reasonable." "Where are you staying in Cutter's Bend?" he asked. "The boarding house on Marsh Street, the one with the blue shutters." "Miss Slater," he said, and he was aware that his voice had shifted very slightly from its auction register into something he was not used to using, something more careful and personal. "I may have some information about a privately held parcel in that area. If you're willing to meet, I can look into the specifics." She regarded him with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had navigated a world that frequently underestimated her, and she said, "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Sullivan. I'll be at the boarding house through Friday." She walked out into the bright Texas morning, and Isaiah stood in the doorway of the Lone Star auction house watching her go. And behind him, Clement Briggs was saying something about the transfer paperwork, and Isaiah was answering it appropriately, because some part of him was always functioning on that professional level, but another part of him was doing something it had not done in a very long time, which was feeling the particular hope of a person who has just encountered someone they want very much to encounter again. He rode out to Odell Price's property that same afternoon. Price was a thin, weathered man of about 60 who kept goats himself and had opinions about everything. His property was a modest spread with a comfortable house that was falling into mild disrepair, and he greeted Isaiah from his front porch with a tin cup of coffee that he did not offer to share. "Sullivan," he said, "come about the land." "I have," Isaiah said, dismounting and looping Charter's reins over the hitching post. "I wanted to ask whether you'd given more thought to selling." Price squinted at him. "Donovan's still after it." Isaiah paused for a fraction of a second. "The Donovan Company is always interested in good water access," he said carefully. "But I'm also asking on my own account. I've had an inquiry from a private party, and I want to understand what options exist." Price looked at him for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, setting down the tin cup, "I'll sell. Been saying I would for a year. Price is what we'd need to agree on." They talked for an hour. The 60 acres ran along a clean stretch of the South Fork with natural vegetation that would suit grazing well, and a reliable spring fed into the creek on the northern edge of the property. It was good land. Isaiah knew it. Price knew he knew it. They settled on a number that was fair by the standards of 1878 in that part of Texas, which meant it was not cheap, but it was honest. And Isaiah shook Price's hand and said he would bring a buyer within the week if it all moved as he expected. Riding back to Cutter's Bend in the long amber light of late afternoon, Isaiah found himself thinking about Theresa Slater in a way that was not professionally relevant, but that he could not seem to stop. He thought about the way she had said her name, plainly and without apology. He thought about the grip of her handshake and the way she had looked at him as if deciding something. He thought about the fact that she had stood in a room full of men who were skeptical of her presence, and had made her bid anyway, precisely, and without flinching, and had handled the outcome with a composure that most of those men would not have managed themselves. He was not a man who was accustomed to being flustered. He had spent the better part of 6 years teaching himself to be steady in situations that were designed to provoke reaction. And yet 4 seconds of silence in that auction room nagged at him with an insistence he could not dismiss. He left a note at the blue-shuttered boarding house on Marsh Street the following morning, addressed to Miss Slater, indicating that he had found a potential property and asking whether she might meet him at the Silver Kettle Diner at noon on Thursday. She was already there when he arrived on Thursday. She was sitting at a corner table with her notebook open and a cup of coffee in front of her, and she was reading something she had written, and she did not notice him come in for a few seconds, which gave him a moment to observe her in an unguarded way that he immediately felt was an intrusion but could not make himself end. She was thoughtful in repose, the way certain people are when they believe no one is watching, and there was something in the set of her jaw that suggested a person who had been making decisions on her own for long enough that it had become her natural state. He took off his hat as he approached, and she looked up. "Mr. Sullivan," she said. "Miss Slater," he said, and sat down across from her. "Thank you for meeting me." "Thank you for looking into it," she said. "What did you find?" He told her about Price's 60 acres. He described the property with the precision he had developed over years of doing this professionally. The water access, the spring on the north edge, the quality of the grazing land, the condition of the existing fencing, which needed some work. He told her the price was asking. He watched her do the arithmetic in the small, readable expressions of her face, which was something he already understood she could not help. "That's within what we can manage," she said. "If the spring is reliable through the dry season. I've known that spring to run through August, which is the worst of it in that part of the county," he said, "but you'd want to verify that yourself." "Can you take me to see it?" she asked. "Would that be appropriate to arrange?" "It would," he said. "Price is agreeable to a visit. We could ride out tomorrow morning if it suits." She considered. "My brother Cooper should come as well. He's the one who knows goats." "Of course," Isaiah said. He ordered coffee. They talked. And this was the part that surprised him most, because it had not been part of his anticipation of this meeting, which he had anticipated more than he wanted to admit. They talked about things that had nothing to do with property. They talked about where they had come from. She was originally from Missouri, she told him, from a family that had farmed near Jefferson City until her father died of fever when she was 15. And her mother remarried a man who was decent but who already had 5 children of his own, and she and Cooper had eventually understood that their futures would have to be built elsewhere. She said this without self-pity, as a statement of geography. He told her he had come from Virginia, from a small family that had held land before the war and had lost most of it after, and that he had come west at 22 with a working knowledge of land law and the ability to stay calm in loud rooms, and that those 2 things had turned out to be sufficient foundation for a life. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Bidding on behalf of someone else." He thought about this with an honesty that he did not usually apply to the question of his own satisfaction. "It's good work," he said. "The Donovans are fair employers, but there are moments when I look at a piece of land and think about what I'd do with it myself." "Then why don't you?" "It's a larger gamble than bidding on behalf of someone else," he said. "If I lose their money, they absorb it. If I lose my own, I have nothing." She looked at him with those amber eyes in the midday light coming through the diner window. "That's a sensible way to think about it," she said. "But sensible and right aren't always the same thing." He did not have an immediate response to that, which was unusual for him, and she smiled slightly at his silence, and he thought that if he were a different kind of man he would have said something about that smile right then. But he was the kind of man he was, so he said, "The ride to Price's property is about an hour and a half on horseback. What time would suit you and your brother?" They rode out the next morning, Isaiah and Theresa and her brother Cooper, who was 24 and had the same auburn hair as his sister but a broader, more open face, and a way of looking at land that was immediately different from most people Isaiah had shown property to. Cooper Slater looked at the grass and the soil and the angle of the slope and the way the water moved in the creek, and he asked questions that told Isaiah he genuinely knew what he was doing. "The spring," Cooper said, crouching at the northern edge of the property where the natural seep pushed clean water into the grass. "Is there any record of this drying up?" "Price says not in 20 years, Isaiah said. "The rock underneath is sandstone with an aquifer beneath. I've seen the same geology hold through drought conditions further west." Cooper stood up and looked at his sister. Theresa was standing at the crest of the small rise that looked south over the creek bed, with the Texas sky enormous above her and the autumn light making everything gold. She had her hat in her hand, and the wind was doing something to the pieces of hair that had escaped their pins, and she was looking at the land with an expression that was almost reverent. "Theresa," Cooper said. "It's right," she said simply and looked back at him. "This is the one." They rode back to Cutter's Bend in the middle of the afternoon, and there was a point along the trail where the path narrowed through a stand of cedar elms, and Isaiah and Theresa fell into single file and then came out the other side riding beside each other again, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her arm, which he did not do. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, looking ahead at the trail. "You can ask," he said. "At the auction Tuesday," she said. "After I bid on the quarter section and Mr. Briggs explained it wasn't divisible, the man standing next to me made a comment. I didn't catch all of it, but I caught enough." She paused. "Do you encounter that often? The assumption that a woman doesn't belong in those rooms?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd be dishonest if I said the assumption wasn't common," he said. "The land auctions in this part of Texas have been a man's domain in the eyes of most people who come to them. That's not right. It's just true." "I know it's true," she said. "I've been operating in that truth for years. Cooper and I have had to do everything twice because one of us is a woman. I handle the money and the paperwork, and I always have to prove the funds are real and the signature is legitimate." "That's an injustice," he said, and he said it plainly because it was plain. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Isaiah was aware that he had not ridden in comfortable silence with anyone in a long time. The particular ease of it was more striking precisely because of how seldom he encountered it. "I'll draw up the offer terms this evening," he said as they came in sight of Cutter's Bend. "If you and Cooper agree to the price and conditions, I can facilitate the transfer. I should tell you, I'm not representing the Donovan Company in this transaction. I'm acting independently." She looked at him with a slight expression of surprise. "Will that cause you any difficulty with them?" "It would only be a problem if the land were something they wanted, and they have no interest in 60 acres without road access," he said. "And also, the Donovans pay me for results. The South Fork parcel is done. This is separate." What he did not say, and what she perhaps intuited anyway from the slight additional care in how he said it, was that he had placed himself in this transaction for reasons that were not entirely professional, and that facilitating this particular purchase was something he genuinely wanted to do regardless of any commission, because he wanted Theresa and Cooper Slater to get their land and their water access and their goats and their future, and he wanted to be the person who had helped make that happen. The offer on Price's 60 acres was accepted within 48 hours. Price was an uncomplicated man in terms of negotiation. When a fair price was offered, he took it, and he seemed pleased to be selling to people who would actually use the land rather than absorbing it into some larger corporate operation. He signed the papers at the county land office on a Friday afternoon, and Theresa signed across from him, and Cooper signed as co-purchaser, and the land recorder stamped the document, and Theresa Slater and her brother Cooper Slater became landowners in Cutter's Bend County, Texas, on the 22nd of October, 1878. She stepped outside the land office into the afternoon light, and Isaiah watched her stand still for a moment with the folded deed in her hand, not reading it, just holding it, and he understood that this was the quiet private ceremony of a person who had worked long and hard towards something and was now standing on the other side of it. "Congratulations," he said, coming to stand beside her. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them in the way that intense relief often is. "I didn't think it would happen this fast," she said. "You knew what you wanted," he said. "That speeds things considerably." She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, a warm and genuine sound with nothing performed about it. "We still have to build a fence line and a house and purchase stock," she said. "This is the beginning of a very long list." "It's a good list," he said. They walked together down the main street of Cutter's Bend in the late afternoon, and Cooper had already disappeared in the direction of the grain store to begin pricing materials, and it was just the two of them on the unpaved street, with the distant sound of a blacksmith somewhere, and the smell of October air over dry Texas grass. And Isaiah Sullivan was aware that he had not felt this present in the world, this precisely located in a moment, in longer than he could clearly remember. "Would you have supper with me?" he asked, "to mark the occasion?" She looked at him with that considering expression she had, the one where she was deciding something. "Yes," she said, "I would." They had supper at the Silver Kettle again, which was the best that Cutter's Bend had to offer in terms of an evening meal, and Cooper joined them after his errand, and was cheerfully hungry, and talked at length about his plans for the property with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who has been holding a dream quietly for years, and has now been given permission to say it out loud. He wanted goats primarily, he explained, but a small cattle herd too, maybe 30 head to start, and he had an idea about the spring water that involved irrigating a kitchen garden for their own use. Isaiah listened and offered practical input where he had it, which was often, because he had seen a great many small operations across this part of Texas succeed and fail, and the ones that failed almost always did so for the same handful of reasons. He talked about fencing priorities and the importance of getting stock sheltered before the first real cold snap. He mentioned a man named Tomas Vega who ran a supply depot outside town and knew where to source good animals at honest prices. Theresa was quiet through much of this, but he caught her watching him across the table in a way that was direct and warm, and said something he was not yet ready to try to name. After Cooper excused himself around 9 o'clock, declaring that he was exhausted and had calculations to do, it was just the two of them at the table with the oil lamp between them and the sound of Cutter's Bend quieting down outside. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "I know," he said. "You went to find Price's land the same day I met you." "It seemed like the useful thing to do," he said, and then, because he was tired of being imprecise about it, he said, "And I wanted to help you." The lamplight was kind to both of them, warm and undemanding, and Theresa Slater looked at him across the small table with an openness that she had earned the right to withhold and had chosen not to. "Thank you, Isaiah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and the effect of it was disproportionate to the syllables involved. "Theresa," he said, and found that he did not immediately have a sentence to attach to it, and that it was all right, because she smiled at him, and the silence was comfortable again. October moved toward November, and the Slaters began the enormous practical work of transforming Price's 60 acres into a going operation. Cooper threw himself into it with a physical energy that Isaiah found impressive, and Theresa managed the money and the planning with a precision that he found even more impressive, because the margins were thin, and every decision about what to spend money on first required both calculation and instinct. Isaiah helped. He told himself initially that he was helping because he was between major acquisitions for the Donovan Company and had time available, which was partially true. He told himself He was helping because the Slaters were new to the area and lacked the local knowledge that he had accumulated over years, which was also true. He told himself these things all the way through the first week of helping, during which he rode out to the property 3 times, connected Cooper with Tomas Vega for stock, and spent an afternoon helping string the first section of fence line. By the second week, he had stopped trying to explain it to himself in professional terms, because the truth was simple and he was an honest man. He was helping because Theresa was there, and because being near her was the best part of any given day, and because he had spent 6 years being very competent and very reliable and very steady, and had not once in that time felt the particular quality of aliveness that he felt when she looked at him and was simply glad he was there. The property was coming together. Cooper had acquired 12 goats from a family west of town who was reducing their herd, and 14 cattle that were young and healthy, and had opinions about their new home that they expressed frequently. A small house was being framed by a local carpenter named Abernathy and his 2 sons, and Theresa had drawn up the plans herself, practical and sensible, with a covered porch on the south side because the afternoon shade would matter in summer. One afternoon in early November, Isaiah arrived at the property to find Theresa up on the first course of wall framing, hammer in hand, helping Abernathy's eldest son nail planking. She was entirely comfortable up there, which he should not have found surprising by that point, but which moved him anyway. "You're going to build it yourself," he called up. She looked down at him. "Abernathy says I'm useful," she said. His words. "You're doing it wrong," said Abernathy's eldest, whose name was Phil and who was 17 and perpetually serious. "I'll defer to Phil," Isaiah said. She laughed and went back to her nailing. He stood on the ground looking up at her for a moment, and Abernathy the elder came up beside him and said under his breath, "That's a capable woman, that one." "Yes," Isaiah said. Abernathy looked at him sideways. "Is she spoken for?" "No," Isaiah said, and then, before he could stop himself, "Not yet." Abernathy made a sound that contained a great deal of meaning in very little volume, and Isaiah walked away toward the fence line before his face could do anything further. He and Theresa had fallen into a habit, over the course of these weeks, of ending the workday's conversation sitting on the unfinished porch frame or on the large flat rock near the spring, and talking while the light went down. They had covered an enormous amount of ground in these conversations. They had talked about the war, carefully and with the weight it deserved, both of them having grown up under its shadow and in its aftermath. They had talked about what land meant in a country where the title to it had been violently contested for generations, and Theresa had spoken plainly about the Comanche and Kiowa people who had lived on this ground before it was parceled and sold, the forced removal that had been completed in the 1870s that allowed the settlements and land sales to exist, and she had said that she thought about it, that it felt important to think about it and not pretend it away, and he had agreed. They had talked about the Reconstruction and what it had meant, about the changes that had come, and the changes that had been resisted and unmade. They had talked about the men who came through these auctions buying land that others had worked, and the systems that made that possible, and they both carried a discomfort about the world they operated in that was real and did not resolve into easy conclusions. These conversations were, Isaiah thought, unlike anything he had conducted in Cutter's Bend before, which tended toward the practical and the transactional. Theresa thought seriously about things. She had read whatever she could get her hands on wherever she had been, and she formed opinions with care and stated them without apology, and she was genuinely interested in what he thought, which was not a quality he took for granted. It was on a Thursday evening in mid-November, with the air finally carrying the edge of proper winter, and the sun going down fast and orange over the cedar elms, that he told her. They were sitting on the flat rock by the spring, and she had her coat pulled around her shoulders, and a cup of coffee she'd brought from the fire Cooper had built near the house frame, and they were talking about nothing in particular, or rather they were in the comfortable space between one topic and the next, and he said, "Theresa, I want to say something." She looked at him with the same clear-eyed attention she always brought to whatever he said. "I came out to Price's land the day after the auction because you told me you were looking for water access on the South Fork," he said. "That was true, but I want to be honest with you. I would not have moved that fast for most clients." "I know," she said quietly. "What I'm saying is that I find you extraordinary," he said, and his voice was steady, the way it always was, but underneath it he was aware of something that felt considerable and a little frightening. "I don't want to misrepresent my situation, so I should say directly that I am not a man of great wealth, and I don't have anything particularly remarkable to offer except my word, my work, and what I feel. And what I feel, if you're willing to hear it, is that I have not been this glad to know someone in a very long time." Theresa was quiet for a moment, looking at him, and then she set her coffee cup down on the rock beside her and she said, "Isaiah Sullivan, I watched you walk across a room and I thought to myself, there is a man who takes up exactly the space he should and not 1 inch more, and that is not a common thing." He looked at her. She looked at him. The spring made its small, persistent sound beside them. "I would very much like for you to court me properly," she said, with a slight smile at the word properly, which was both formal and accurate for what she meant. "If that is what you're describing." "That is exactly what I'm describing," he said, and so it began properly. Whatever it had been before, which was arguably already something, it became named and acknowledged and real. He came to the property on days that were not work days or came in the evenings after work days, and sometimes he brought things, food from town or a book he thought she might want, not elaborate gifts but considered ones, things he had genuinely thought about. She cooked supper at the small camp stove they'd set up inside the partially completed house, increasingly well-equipped meals as the weeks passed, and she sourced more provisions. She was a good cook, practical and inventive with what she had, and there was something about eating a meal she had made while sitting at a workbench-turned table inside walls that were still partly open to the outside air that felt more real than any meal he could think of having had before. Cooper treated him with the measured friendliness of a younger brother who was paying attention. He never said anything direct, but one evening when Theresa had stepped outside, he said to Isaiah across the workbench, "She doesn't make decisions fast and she doesn't unmake them, if that's useful information." "It is," Isaiah said. "She's been taking care of herself for a long time," Cooper said. "I know that," Isaiah said. Cooper nodded and looked at his plate, and that was the entirety of the conversation, but it meant what it was intended to mean, which was, "I see you, and I'm watching, and you should understand what you're doing." December arrived, and with it the first real cold, the kind of flat gray cold of a Texas winter that is not dramatic but is persistent and thorough. The house was nearly finished. Abernathy and his sons had done good work, and Theresa had overseen every decision about it with the exactness of a person who intended to live in it for decades. The porch faced south as planned. The kitchen had a proper wood stove. There were 2 bedrooms, one for Cooper and one for Theresa, and a main room that was generous enough to be useful. Isaiah came to see the house on the day the Slaters moved in, which they did without ceremony, carrying their belongings from the boarding house in 2 wagon loads that Cooper had arranged. He helped carry boxes and furniture, and the inexplicable number of items that 2 people accumulate in the process of preparing to settle permanently somewhere. When everything was inside and Cooper had gone out to see to the animals, Theresa stood in the middle of her kitchen with her hands at her sides and looked around the room, and Isaiah stood in the doorway. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was completely unguarded and complete. "I have a home," she said very simply. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and he took her hands in both of his carefully, the way you hold something you understand the value of, and he said, "You built it." She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the distance between their faces was very small, and he said, "May I?" in a voice that had gone very quiet, and she said yes in the same register, and he kissed her with the careful precision of a person who is attempting to communicate something that words have been inadequate for. She kissed him back. Christmas came to Cutter's Bend the way it did in a small Texas town in 1878, quietly and practically, with little of the elaborate ceremony that people in larger cities managed, and more of the simple exchange of warmth that people in hard places were actually good at. There was a social at the church, which Isaiah attended with Theresa on his arm, and which required a certain amount of absorbing of sideways looks from people who had known him as a solitary professional figure and were now recalibrating. He did not mind. He found he minded remarkably little about what the town made of his life now that it contained her. They danced, which he did adequately and she did well, and he told her she danced well, and she told him he was doing fine, and he laughed and improved. She met his horse Charter properly this time, and Charter demonstrated his opinion of her by attempting to eat her coat, which she took as an endorsement. He took her to the South Fork parcel he had acquired for the Donovan Company, the one she had tried to bid on that first day, and they walked the creek bank in the cold December air, and he showed her the water access and the way the land lay, and she asked intelligent questions about the cattle operation the Donovans would run there, and he realized that she thought about land the way he did, as a living thing with logic of its own, and this was an extraordinary thing to find in a person. January of 1879 came in hard and cold, and Isaiah found that his work for the Donovan Company had begun to feel differently weighted against the other things in his life. He had always been focused on the next acquisition, the next auction, the next parcel to evaluate. Now there was a gravitational pull in the direction of Cutter's Bend that he had not previously had to navigate, and specifically toward 60 acres along the South Fork with a house that had a south-facing porch. He had a conversation with the Donovan Company's regional manager, a man named Ferguson, who came through Cutter's Bend in late January and met him at the hotel for supper. Ferguson was an efficient, decent man who understood that good agents were not unlimited resources. "There may be an opportunity," Ferguson said, over the remains of a beef stew that the hotel kitchen had made a reasonable effort with, "to restructure your arrangement with the company. We'd like to expand operations north of here. That would require more of your time and more travel. Better compensation, of course." Isaiah had known this conversation was coming, or something like it. The Donovan Company was growing, and it had been growing in large part because of the ground he had been laying for them. The natural next step was for them to pull him further into the organization, deeper into travel, more itinerant. "I need some time to consider it," he said. Ferguson nodded, unsurprised. "Take what you need, not forever but a reasonable time." He walked from the hotel to Theresa's property in the cold January dark, which was a walk of 20 minutes and which he had made enough times now that he knew every rut in the road. The lights were on in the house. He could see them through the front window. He knocked. She opened the door and looked at him, and something in his face told her this was not a routine visit. "Come in," she said. Cooper was not home, she told him. He had gone to town for supplies. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and he told her about Ferguson's offer. He told her all of it, the better compensation, the travel, what it would mean in terms of his time and his location. He told her because she deserved to know and because it was not a decision he felt he should make without being honest with her about it. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to stay in Cutter's Bend," he said. "I want to build something of my own. I've been working on behalf of other people's land for 6 years, and there's a part of me that is ready to stop that." He paused. "But I also want to be practical because practical matters, and I need to know what my situation is before I can know what I can offer." "What do you mean, what you can offer?" she said. He looked at her directly. "Theresa, I love you. I have been certain of that since December, and I was moving toward it since October. I want to know if you will marry me. And I want to be honest that the answer to that question should inform what I do about Ferguson's offer. Because If you'll marry me, then I'm not going anywhere that takes me away from here, and I'll find other work or make my own opportunities, and we'll figure out the rest together. But if that's not what you want, then the practical question has a different answer. Theresa Slater looked at him across the kitchen table in her house that she had built on her land along the South Fork in January of 1879, and she said, "I love you, Isaiah Sullivan. I have been certain of that since November, and I was moving toward it since October," a small echo of his own words. "And yes, I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the wood stove made its warm ticking sound, and outside the Texas cold was doing what it did, and none of that mattered. He told Ferguson the following morning that he would not be taking the expanded role, and Ferguson accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had anticipated it as a real possibility. They renegotiated to a reduced but continued arrangement, wherein Isaiah would handle a limited number of specific acquisitions per year for the Donovan Company within the local territory, in exchange for a retainer that was modest but reliable. It was not the full salary the expanded role would have offered, but it was a foundation, and Isaiah Sullivan was very good at building on foundations. He also, in the weeks that followed, began quietly developing something he had been thinking about for longer than he had admitted to himself. He had years of knowledge about the land market in this part of Texas. He knew the prices, the parcels, the owners, the timing, the legal process, and the network of people who needed to navigate it. He began offering himself as an independent land agent, not exclusively employed by any company but available to individual buyers and sellers who needed someone who understood what they were dealing with. He set fair rates. He was honest about what he knew and what he did not. Word spread the way word spreads in a territory where people talk about reliable men, because reliable men are not so common that their reputation becomes unremarkable. The wedding was held in March of 1879. At the small Methodist church in Cutter's Bend, on a Saturday when the first suggestion of spring had arrived in the form of bluebonnets starting along the roadside, and the air carrying something less hostile than it had all winter. Cooper stood with Theresa, and a man named Walter Hodge, who was Isaiah's closest friend in Cutter's Bend and a deputy sheriff who had known him for 4 years, stood with Isaiah. Theresa wore a dress of cream-colored cotton with a dark blue ribbon at the waist, which she had made herself over the preceding 3 weeks with a focus and precision that she applied to everything. She walked down the aisle of the small church with her arm through Cooper's, and Isaiah watched her come, and thought about the day she had walked into Clement Briggs's auction house, and he had forgotten how to speak, and thought that whatever failure of language had happened to him then had been entirely the right response to have. The minister said the words. They said their own words to each other, and Theresa's voice was steady and warm and absolutely certain, and Isaiah's was everything he wanted it to be, clear and felt and true. Walter Hodge made a sound during the vows that might have been his throat and might have been something else, and chose not to be examined on the question afterward. They were married. The town of Cutter's Bend had the modest celebration that small towns manage, which is to say a great deal of warmth distributed in practical and unpretentious forms, good food and fiddle music, and people who were genuinely glad for them. The Sullivan property, which is what the Slater land became in name while remaining entirely co-owned in legal fact, because Theresa had strong opinions about property law and Isaiah thought she was right, grew through the spring of 1879, with the momentum of 2 people who were both capable and now aligned. The goat herd expanded to 28 animals. The cattle herd reached 22 head, still young and being managed carefully for growth. The spring on the north edge proved itself through a dry April without faltering. Isaiah's independent land agent work grew steadily. He developed a reputation somewhat different from his auction reputation, which had been founded on intimidation and authority, and more in the direction of honesty and precision. People began coming to him not because they feared he would outbid them, but because they trusted that he would tell them the true value of what they were looking at and not add to it for his own benefit. He still attended auctions. He would always attend auctions because land moved through auctions in this part of Texas, and an agent who did not understand that market was not much use to anyone. But the quality of his presence at them changed. He was still effective. He was still capable of the single, well-placed bid that redirected a room. But the ferocity that had been his trademark, the quality that had made grown men reconsider their own intentions when he cleared his throat, had softened into something that was still powerful but was no longer purely that. It was now the authority of a man who had something real to protect and was not indifferent to the corresponding obligations. Theresa sometimes came with him. Not to the formal auctions, not usually, though she went to a few and handled them with the composed competence he expected. More often she came to the meetings beforehand, the conversations with sellers and buyers that preceded formal processes, and he found that she was better than him at certain aspects of those conversations. She was better at listening in a way that made the other person feel heard, which caused them to be more honest, which caused the conversation to be more productive. She asked questions that got to the point faster than most people's statements. He deferred to her when she was better, which was simply accurate rather than remarkable, though he understood that some people found it remarkable. In the summer of 1879, they discovered that Theresa was expecting a child. She told him on an evening in June, sitting on the south porch in the blue dusk, and she told him with a directness that was characteristic, and with a look on her face that was a complicated mixture of things, joy and apprehension, and the particular expression of someone who is holding something enormous and is still finding the shape of it. He sat with her on the porch for a long time, not talking much, because the moment did not require talking, and the stars came up over the Texas South, and the goats made their small sounds in the pen below the house, and Charter shifted in his stall in the shed. And Isaiah Sullivan held his wife's hand, and understood that his life was entirely different from the life he had been living 18 months ago, and that this was the truest good luck he had ever encountered. The baby came in February of 1880, in the middle of a cold night that the midwife, a competent and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Dabrowski, navigated with the professional calm of 30 years of experience. It was a boy. He was red-faced and emphatic in his opinions from the first minute, and they named him Thomas William Sullivan. Thomas for no particular reason except that it sounded right when they said it aloud, and William for Isaiah's father, who had died in Virginia when Isaiah was 20, and who had been a quiet man with a great deal of dignity. Cooper, who had been sitting outside in the cold for several hours in a state of enormous concern that he had been attempting to disguise as composure, came in to see his nephew, and stood holding him with the slightly stunned expression of a person encountering something they had understood intellectually without being quite prepared for experientially. "He's very small," Cooper said. "He's a standard size," Mrs. Dabrowski said crisply. "He's perfect," Theresa said from the bed in a voice made of exhaustion and something larger than it. Isaiah was sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, and he had his arm around her shoulders, and Thomas William Sullivan was in Cooper's arms making the sounds of a person newly arrived in an unsatisfactory world, and Isaiah looked at his wife and felt the full weight of everything that had led to this specific moment. Every auction, every piece of land evaluated and bid on and won or lost, every year in this territory. Every solitary evening on his own small porch before any of this existed, and understood with the quiet certainty that was his native register that it had all been pointing here. "Are you all right?" he said to her quietly. "I am wonderful," she said, and meant it in the full meaning of that word, the one that includes difficult and hard and transforming and true. Thomas grew through 1880 the way babies do, which is with an absolute disregard for anyone's schedule and a relentless interest in everything he encountered. He was a brown-eyed baby who became a brown-eyed toddler with a particular attachment to the goats, which was perhaps inevitable given that he was introduced to them at 6 weeks of age and spent much of his first 2 years within sight or sound of them. He called them something that was not quite goat but which everyone understood to mean goat, and which the animals appeared to take as a reasonable address. Cooper doted on him without any self-consciousness about it, which was characteristic. The operation continued to grow. By the end of 1880, they had 41 goats and 30 cattle, and were turning a modest but genuine profit. Theresa managed the accounts with a ledger book that was a model of organization, every expenditure and income recorded in her precise handwriting, with notations that made the logic of every decision transparent. Isaiah had seen the books of men who had been in ranching for decades and whose records were half as clear. His land agency work had by this point expanded to the point where he had taken on a formal assistant, a young man of 22 named Darnell Bright, who was quick at arithmetic and had a good memory for property boundaries, and who was, Isaiah had noted within the first week, also scrupulously honest, which was the quality he valued most. He paid Darnell fairly and treated him as a person whose work mattered, which Darnell responded to with a loyalty that money alone would not have purchased. There was a moment in the spring of 1881 that Isaiah thought about afterward for a long time. He was at an auction in Cutter's Bend, a larger one than usual, a significant parcel along the main county road that had drawn bidders from as far as Abilene. He was there independently, representing a family named the Mornos who had been ranching in the area for 2 generations, and who needed the road access the parcel provided. The Mornos were not wealthy, but they had a legitimate need and had saved carefully for years. The bidding was intense. A speculative land company out of Dallas had sent an agent with essentially unlimited authorization, and he was bidding with the aggressive patience of someone who intends to simply outlast every other voice in the room. Isaiah had bid strategically, holding back, letting the price climb, waiting for the moment when the psychology of the room would shift. He was standing in his usual position near the back, and he was aware, in the peripheral way of long practice, of where everyone in the room was standing, and one of the people in the room was Theresa, who had come to watch this particular auction because the Mornos were their neighbors, and because she had business of her own with Clement Briggs about a property line question after. She was standing along the left wall, which was where she had stood the first day he had ever seen her, and she was watching him with those amber eyes, and he looked at her across the room for exactly 1 second in the middle of his bidding calculation, and the effect was the same as it had always been, which is to say that his ordered professional thinking briefly dissolved into something warmer and less categorical. He made himself look back at Clement Briggs and the speculative agent and the logic of the numbers. He won the parcel for the Mornos. He won it well at a price that was fair rather than extravagant, because he had timed his decisive bid for the moment when the speculative agent was off balance, and the room had gone very quiet around that bid, the way rooms always went quiet when Isaiah Sullivan's voice landed with particular intent. Afterward, walking out into the afternoon, Theresa fell into step beside him. "You hesitated," she said. "Briefly," he said. "In the middle." "I saw you," he said. She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that was both pleased and entirely aware of what she was, which is to say, the cause of the hesitation. "Does it still happen?" she said. "The forgetting?" He looked at her. "Every time," he said. She laughed and took his arm, and they walked down the main street of Cutter's Bend in the spring afternoon, and Thomas was waiting at home with Cooper and the goats and the cattle and the ledger book and the south porch and all the rest of their life, and it was the best thing in the world. The years moved in the way good years do, which is with a fullness that makes them feel simultaneously long and too short. By 1882, the Sullivan operation had grown to nearly 100 acres, having acquired 2 additional small parcels adjacent to their original 60, when their owners decided to sell, and Isaiah heard about it early enough to make first offers. The cattle herd was 50 head. The goat operation had become genuinely noteworthy in the county, partly because of the quality of the animals, and partly because Theresa had begun selling goat milk cheese to several establishments in Cutter's Bend and one general store in the next town over, which was a detail she had organized entirely on her own initiative, and which brought in a reliable supplemental income that was completely hers in origin. Thomas, who was 2 and then 3, and then approaching 4 with an increasing verbal confidence that gave no one any rest, had developed a personality that was the particular combination of his parents that made people smile when they saw it, which is to say he was thoughtful and direct and curious, and occasionally stubborn in ways that both Isaiah and Theresa recognized without wanting to acknowledge too specifically. Cooper announced in the autumn of 1882 that he intended to court a young woman named Priscilla Navarro, whose family ranched 15 miles south, which he announced to Isaiah and Theresa at the supper table one evening with the manner of a person reporting a weather forecast, and then looked at both of them with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. Theresa said, "Tell me about her." Cooper said, "She's got good sense and she thinks about things. She handles their horses." "When do we meet her?" Theresa said. "Sunday," Cooper said, with relief at having gotten through the announcement. Priscilla Navarro came to Sunday supper and was a dark-eyed, composed young woman of 22 who handled Thomas immediately and expertly, which Thomas responded to with the suspicious approval of a small child who has been correctly assessed. Isaiah liked her on instinct, and confirmed that instinct over the course of the evening. Theresa liked her after 15 minutes and confirmed it over coffee when Cooper and Isaiah had taken Thomas outside. Cooper and Priscilla were married in the spring of 1883 and built a small house on the southern portion of the Sullivan property, where the land leveled out and the view was clear in 3 directions, and Priscilla became part of the operation with the ease of someone who had always known how operations like this worked. Isaiah's land agency business had by 1883 become something that justified a proper office, which he rented on the main street of Cutter's Bend, a single room with 2 desks and a filing cabinet and a window that faced east and caught the morning light. Darnell had been with him 3 years by then, and was good enough at the work that Isaiah was able to take on larger and more complex matters, knowing the daily details were managed. He had navigated some difficult situations in those years, disputes between neighbors about boundaries, water rights arguments that could have turned ugly, and that he had helped resolve through mediation and an encyclopedic knowledge of the relevant land law. The occasional situation where he had to deliver news to a client that the land they wanted was not going to be achievable at the price they expected, which required honesty and a good deal of careful managing of expectations. He had also, in 1882, been present at an auction where a situation had arisen that he found himself thinking about in terms of justice in a way that would not leave him alone. A small farming family, the Hendersons, had been attempting to buy back a parcel of land they had sold under duress during a hard year, and the auction had gone against them because a larger operation had come in with capital the Hendersons could not match. Isaiah had not been representing any party in that auction. He had been there as an observer. He had watched the Hendersons walk out of the auction house with nothing, and the image had stayed with him. He had looked into whether there was anything to be done legally or practically, and had found a complicated answer, as he usually did when he looked into these things carefully. He had, over the following months, helped the Hendersons identify a different parcel with similar characteristics that was available at a price they could reach, and had reduced his fee substantially to make the transaction work, and had felt more satisfied with that outcome than with several much larger acquisitions he had facilitated. He told Theresa about it in detail one evening, and she had listened and said, That's the work you should be doing more of. It doesn't pay as well, he said. A lot of right things don't, she said. They talked about it over several evenings, and what came out of those conversations was a change in how he structured his practice. He kept the commercial work, because it paid the bills and he was good at it. But he formalized a part of what he did that was specifically oriented toward helping smaller landholders navigate a system that was not designed for them, at reduced rates calibrated to what people could actually afford. He was not a lawyer and could not provide legal representation, but he could provide information and advocacy and access to the system, and he could make sure that people who were easy to overlook were not overlooked in rooms where he had influence. It was not a solution to anything systemic. He was honest with himself about that. The land system in Texas in the 1880s was what it was, and it had been built on displacement and dispossession that went back generations, and was not going to be addressed by one land agent in one county. But he could do what he could do, and Theresa kept the accounts and made it work financially, and that was what they had. In the summer of 1883, Theresa told him she was expecting again. She told him on the south porch in the early morning, before Thomas was awake, with the sunrise coming up over the cedar elms and the goats already being vocal about their opinions of the day. He looked at her in the morning light and he thought about the first October he had known her, the blueness of her faded dress and the leather satchel under her arm and the way she had stood in a room full of skeptical men and made her bid anyway, and he thought about every morning since, and he said, "I love you." "I know," she said and smiled. "I love you too. Are you pleased?" "Completely," he said. This baby was a girl. She arrived in February of 1884, in better circumstances than Thomas's birth, because Mrs. Dabrowski had had time to develop a system, and Theresa knew more about what to expect. She was a girl with dark auburn hair the shade of her mother's and gray eyes the shade of Isaiah's, which combination struck everyone who saw her as immediately right and somewhat inevitable. They named her Clara Josephine Sullivan. Clara because Theresa had always loved that name, and Josephine for Priscilla's grandmother, who had come from Mexico and who had a presence in family stories that made her feel like someone worth honoring. Thomas, who was 4 years old and had been briefed on the arrival of a sibling with the thoroughness that his parents applied to his education generally, regarded Clara with a complicated mixture of fascination and proprietary suspicion for approximately 2 weeks, and then settled into a relationship of decided protectiveness that manifested itself as following her everywhere she went once she became mobile, which she did earlier than anyone expected. Cooper became an uncle with an enthusiasm that continued to be entirely unself-conscious, and Priscilla was wonderful with both children, in a way that was clearly innate rather than performed. The summer of 1884 was the hottest in memory, and the cattle needed more attention, and the spring on the north edge of the property worked harder than it had been asked to before, and there were days when the heat made everything difficult, but they got through it with the combined resource of 2 households, 2 capable men and 2 capable women, and 1 child who was old enough to help, and 1 who was not but who was interested in watching. And at the end of the summer, the animals were all right, and the land was all right, and the accounts were all right, and they sat on the south porch in the September air, and drank cold water from the spring and were tired in the good way. Isaiah spent a lot of time on that porch, in the evenings and the early mornings, in all the years that followed. He thought about things there that he would not have known to think about before, in the years when his porch had been a different and emptier thing. He thought about how the quality of a life was not really measured in its largest events, but in its accumulated ordinary days, and how the ordinary days of his life had become so entirely full that there was not room in them for any of the hollowness he had carried around, without quite naming it, before the autumn of 1878. He thought about what Theresa had said to him at that first lunch when he had described his cautious professional reasoning, and she had said, "Sensible and right aren't always the same thing." He had been a sensible man living a sensible life, and it had been correct and sufficient in the way a foundation is correct and sufficient. But a foundation is not a house. She had been right. She was usually right, and he had come to trust that without it reducing anything in him. It simply added to what he had access to. In the spring of 1885, Darnell Bright told him that he had been offered a position with a larger land company in Austin, and that he intended to take it, which was entirely right for Darnell, and which Isaiah said directly while also meaning it. He shook Darnell's hand and wrote him a letter of recommendation that was thorough and accurate, and which Darnell kept for years. He found a new assistant within the month, a young woman named Harriet Cole, whose father had been a surveyor and who had grown up reading plat maps, and who was, within 6 weeks, more useful than most people Isaiah had worked with. Theresa, when she met Harriet, said immediately, "She's excellent, keep her." He did. The years continued. Thomas went to school in Cutter's Bend at the age of 6, which was 1886, and demonstrated an aptitude for arithmetic that pleased his father, and for argument that surprised no one who knew his mother. Clara went to school 2 years later, and was from the first week the child who read everything available and then came home and reported on it at length, which she did in the same amber-eyed, direct way as her mother, sitting at the supper table and speaking with the confidence of someone who assumes their audience is interested, which in her family they consistently were. Cooper and Priscilla had a daughter in 1886, named Rosa, who became Thomas's particular friend across the years, which was the kind of thing that happens in families living in proximity, and which everyone observed with the quiet satisfaction of people watching good things arrange themselves. Isaiah turned 40 in 1887, which happened on a Saturday in September. Theresa organized a gathering of the people in their lives, which was more people than either of them had had in their lives 6 years earlier, neighbors and clients and friends, and the various people who had accumulated in the specific way that communities do when you live somewhere long enough to matter in it. Walter Hodge came, the deputy-turned-sheriff by then, and Tomas Vega and Abernathy the carpenter, older and slower but still at work, and Clement Briggs the auctioneer, who was redder in the face than ever and who pumped Isaiah's hand with tremendous energy. Isaiah stood on his south porch that evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed and Cooper and Priscilla had walked home through the September dark, and he had his arm around Theresa's shoulders, and the night was warm, and the stars were enormous the way they always were over this part of Texas, and he said, "I would not have predicted any of this, not a single specific detail of it. What would you have predicted?" She said he thought about it. "More auctions," he said, "quieter evenings, a horse and a smaller house and a reasonable pension eventually." She leaned against his shoulder. "Do you miss it?" "Not for a second," he said. She tilted her head up to look at him, and he looked back at her, and she was 36 years old and had laugh lines now that had not been there in 1878, and her hair still would not entirely stay where she pinned it, and her eyes were the same warm amber they had always been, and she was the most entirely herself person he had ever known, which had been true on the first day and was more true now. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "You've mentioned it." "I'll keep mentioning it," he said. "Good," she said. He kissed her on the forehead, and she settled against his side, and they stood on the south porch of the house she had planned and watched the Texas night in companionable silence. And the goats were quiet, and the cattle were quiet, and the spring on the north edge of the property kept up its small, faithful sound, and everything that was theirs was theirs. In 1889, Theresa took over the formal management of the ranch operation from Cooper, not because Cooper was inadequate, but because the operation had grown to a size that required the kind of organized oversight she was better suited to provide, and Cooper was more needed in the physical work of the animals and the land. And they had simply arrived at a natural division of responsibility that happened to align with their actual strengths, rather than with what anyone expected based on who they were. Theresa kept the books and managed the contracts and negotiated the prices when they sold cattle, and took on the relationships with the cheese buyers who by then were supplying 4 different establishments in 2 towns. And she did all of this from a desk in the corner of the main room with a view of the south porch and the cedar elms beyond. Isaiah had long since stopped trying to describe what she did as separate from what he did, because their work had become intertwined in the practical way of 2 people who have been building the same thing from different angles for long enough that the distinction stops being meaningful. He brought land knowledge and the agency work and the network of relationships that had built over a decade. She brought financial management and the operational backbone of the ranch, and a clarity of judgment about people and situations that had saved them from several decisions that would have been wrong. Together, they had built something that was, by any reasonable measure, solid and good. Thomas, at 12, had begun helping with the land work in the summers, riding out with his father to walk property lines and attend the occasional preliminary meeting, and he asked questions that were intelligent and retained the answers. And Isaiah found that teaching him was one of the most genuinely satisfying things he did in a life that contained many satisfying things. Clara, at 8, had declared her intention to become a schoolteacher with a certainty that no one who knew her doubted, and had already in some informal sense begun practicing on every available person who would sit still. On a Tuesday in October of 1890, exactly 12 years to the month from the day Theresa Slater had walked through the door of the Lone Star Auction House in Cutter's Bend, Texas, Isaiah attended an auction on the south side of town for a parcel of bottomland that one of his clients was interested in. The room was full. Clement Briggs's health had declined enough that his son Marcus now ran the auctions, but the room and the format and the smell of packed men in an October morning were all entirely the same. Isaiah stood in his usual place near the back, hat in his hands, and waited for the bidding to begin. Theresa was in the room. She had come because the parcel intersected with a water rights question she had been tracking, and also because, 12 years later, she still sometimes came to auctions with him when the occasion permitted. She had positioned herself along the left wall. He looked at her across the room. She looked back at him. She smiled, a small and private and completely certain smile, the smile of a person who knows exactly where she stands and is entirely content with it. Marcus Briggs called the opening bid, and Isaiah turned to face the podium, and the number appeared in his mind in its usual clarity, ordered and ready, and he waited for his moment. He was still the most effective voice in the room. That had not changed, but what it came from had changed entirely, from the focused ferocity of a man with nothing particular to lose to the steady assurance of a man who had a great deal and intended to protect it, and who had learned that assurance of this kind is quieter and more durable than ferocity. He won the parcel for his client at a fair price, in 4 bids, and signed the paperwork, and shook the necessary hands, and then walked to where Theresa was waiting by the door with her satchel under her arm, exactly as she had been 12 years ago, except that now the satchel was better quality, and the dress was not faded at the shoulders, and she was looking at him with the expression of a person who has been watching someone she knows very well navigate something they are very good at. "Nicely done," she said. "Thank you," he said, and offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked out of the Lone Star Auction House together into the October morning, into the blue Texas sky, and the smell of cedar and dry grass, and the distant sound of a train from the station at the edge of town, which had not existed when they had first walked this street together, and which was now simply part of the landscape of their world. The walk home took them past the land office where they had signed the deed to their 60 acres, which was now 104 acres. It took them past the Silver Kettle Diner, which was still there under the same name though different management, where they had sat at a corner table and talked for the first time about things that were not property. It took them past the church where they had been married on a March day with bluebonnets starting at the roadside, and past Abernathy's carpentry shop, and past the land agent's office on the main street where Isaiah's sign was hung above the door, and Harriet Cole's desk was visible through the window. They walked past all of it and out the eastern edge of town, and along the road toward the South Fork, and the October light was the same deep amber it had always been in this season, and the cedar elms were the same, and the sound of the spring on the north edge of their property reached them before they could see the house. Thomas and Clara were home from school, their horses tied at the post, and the smoke from the kitchen stove was rising in the clear air. Cooper was somewhere in the lower pasture, audible by way of his voice carrying instructions to something that was presumably the cattle. Priscilla's kitchen window had light in it. Rosa was probably with Thomas as she usually was after school. Theresa stopped on the low rise above the house and looked down at all of it for a moment. Isaiah stopped with her. "You know what I thought the first time I stood on this piece of ground," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I thought this is the one, this is the right place." She paused. "I didn't know yet that I meant more than the land." He looked at her. This woman who had walked into a room and made him forget every word he knew. This woman who had bid on land in a room full of men who didn't think she belonged there and had not been deterred. This woman who had built a house and a ranch and a life, and who had let him be part of all of it. And he thought that the word grateful was not large enough for what he felt, and that the word lucky was not accurate enough. And that love was the closest thing to the right word, and even it was insufficient to the task. "Yes," he said, "you did." She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the October sky was enormous over their heads, and the spring on the north edge of the land they had made their own kept up its faithful sound, as it had every year for as long as they had lived here and would go on for every year after. They walked down to the house together. Thomas came out to meet them at the gate, 12 years old and already nearly to Isaiah's shoulder, with his father's steadiness and his mother's eyes. And he reported in the efficient way he had inherited from both his parents that supper was in progress, that the older goat had been acting differently today in a way that might be worth looking at, and that he had finished his arithmetic problems, and they were on the table if his father wanted to check them. Isaiah ruffled his son's hair and said he would check them after supper, and Thomas went back inside. Clara appeared in the doorway behind her brother and said, at some length and with great conviction, several things about what had happened at school that day, which Isaiah absorbed with the genuine interest he had always had in her particular way of engaging with the world, and which Theresa listened to with the expression of a woman who knows exactly where her daughter's gift for communication comes from and does not feel the need to name the source. They went inside. The kitchen was warm. The supper smelled good. The lamplight was the same kind and undemanding gold it had always been in this room, in every season since they had first lit a lamp in it, and the sounds of the ranch came through the walls, the animals and the wind and the water, all of it continuous and reliable, the ordinary music of the life they had made. Isaiah Sullivan sat down at the kitchen table across from his wife and across from his children, and everything was present that needed to be present, and everything was resolved that needed resolution, and the doors of the past were all properly closed behind them, and the door of the future was open, but not anxiously so, because they had learned what they needed to know to walk through whatever came. He reached across the table and touched Theresa's hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and Clara was still talking, and Thomas was explaining something about the goat to his mother, and the fire in the stove was doing what fires do in October, and Isaiah Sullivan, who had once been the most feared voice at every land auction in the territory, who had once stood silent in a crowded room because a woman had walked in and every word had left him entirely, sat in the full warm center of his own life and was at peace with every word of it.